Let's hope this works now.
That's better.
Very nice seeing and hearing you.
Yeah. What? So what? I mean, what's a day of interviews without some issue with Zoom at some point, right? It's par for the course, I think. How you doing, man?
I'm great. How are you doing?
Yeah, pretty good. Pretty good. Yeah, it's a nice sunny day. Hopefully, it's not the heat wave we've experienced for the last week, but otherwise, great. What
Uh,
time is it where you are?
I was just gonna ask, it's 2 a.m. right where I am.
2 a.m. I
Yes.
am sorry. I could have done this at a different time. That's rough,
No
man.
worries, no worries. I was wondering if to get up early or stay up late. I ended up staying up late.
Yeah, yeah. Either way, it kind of sucks, doesn't it? It's really the it's about as bad a time as you could get.
And
Apologies again.
I'm kind of jealous for a heat wave also because we have like I don't know 2 degrees Celsius.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
winter
So
here.
we went on a little family trip to New Zealand where it was kind of like 15, and by the end of it, we are like, oh, I can't wait to get back home. It's 36 degrees and humid. It's absolutely brutal.
Oh man. All right. All right. I already started recording. I hope
Oh,
everything
wonderful.
works. I have my phone here just in case something with the audio is messing things up, but let's hope everything
Cool. No
works.
worries. Sounds good.
All right. Great. Let's start. Hello, everybody. I am Fritz from Lots of Music, and we have a very special guest tonight, the amazing Sam Vallon from one of Australia's finest prog acts, Caligula's Horse.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Not only are you the musical director, might I say, and can I even say leader of one of today's most exciting bands of the genre, you also hold a doctorate at the Queensland Conservatorium and work as a teacher, arranger, producer, engineer, session musician. Sam, first of all, can you tell us what don't you work as?
I mean, I've just tried to kind of build my entire career as much as I can around music, and yes, that has required me to do a lot of different things. It's not like it used to be in the old days. I don't work as a I don't do any manual labor, and I feel like that's probably pretty bad for my body.
All right, then. All right, so then let's stick with what you can do or what you are doing. First of all, you and Caligula's Horse were finally able to go out on an extensive headliner tour this year to promote your 2020 album, Rise Radiant. How was it to finally bring those songs to the stage, not only in your home country, but all around the world?
I mean, it was incredible. Like we have this saying in the band that you kind of don't really know an album. You don't know your own music until you take it on the road, and you get to experience the interface that you have with your fans in
Mm-hmm.
doing so. And we never got to do that with Rise Radiant, so it kind of never really felt like we finished that album period, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
We didn't really get to live it the way we normally do. So finally doing that this year, like playing across Europe, playing across Latin America, and to the Prog Power Festival in the US, and of course all around Australia, it was. It felt like a proper end to a chapter that for a long time, and I'm sure you'd agree, just felt like it was never going to end.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of amazing.
All right, sounds good. I believe these were the first shows you guys performed as a four-piece. Is that true? Or were there...
We did. No, so we actually did a tour around Australia in late 2022 with a band called Butterfly Effect. That was
Yeah.
our first kind of exploration of the four piece. And for what it's worth, when we did that tour, it was actually kind of a test in a lot of ways. Like we wanted to just see if the band would work in that arrangement. Like me taking on more kind of more guitar parts,
Yeah.
putting some more kind of ambient and keys and stuff like that on the backing tracks, and sort of seeing how it
Yeah.
comes out. And we loved it. It was incredible. Like more room, fewer people in the touring party. Like all of that stuff is just fantastic when you're a band
Yeah.
like ours.
All right,
Yeah.
sounds good. Can you elaborate how you, in the end, managed to perform in this constellation? Did you just grow a few more fingers, or did you have to learn more stuff? Or...
No, I mean, for what it's worth, like the way that I tend to write the music is largely geared around one guitar anyway. Like there's almost always one primary guitar part. There's usually a bunch of layers and things like that, but for the most part, they're auxiliary layers. Like they're not layers that need to be there, or layers that I can just have kind of quietly on a track or something. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
But what it did require is, I'm not able to sort of sit up on stage and have a rest while the other guitarist takes the main part, and I can just chill for a bit. It's a lot more work as a guitarist. But honestly, it's one of these things where we weren't sure how well it would work, but when we realized just how easy it made everything else around touring, it felt like a no-brainer. So we're pretty happy as a four-piece right now.
Sounds good. I was actually fortunate enough to see you guys perform in Berlin last summer. And
wonderful. It was a cool gig.
Yeah, very cool. There was the one show where you... Sorry?
Actually, it was a hot gig, is what I should say.
It was. I was just going to say, you really set the place on fire in a way. And it was that one show where you spontaneously decided to throw dark hair down at us. And the
That's right!
And the crowd just went totally nuts, me included.
So yeah, we don't often get. Yeah, you know how it is like at prog shows. Like prog people tend to be quite reserved, and like sometimes we get a bit of heckling or whatever. But it just felt like the demand for Dark Hair Down was so real. I think there was a chant or something, wasn't there? I can't remember exactly how it got to it, but it was just like, look, let's just do it. Okay. Fortunately, we had it sort of prepped. We'd rehearsed it for a tour before that one. But that was so cool. And you're right. You were definitely the only ones to hear that on that tour.
I was just gonna ask how you pulled that off, just to pull out the song like that, and you need everything prepared and the backing tracks and the click track.
It's the trade secrets. Like we have on our controller, we have like a bunch of other songs that we might have had on the repertoire previous kind of ready, but there's definitely a limitation. Like if you asked us to play some obscure song off of like Moments from Ephemeral City or something, we just would I just won't know it at that moment in time. But we got kind of lucky with Dark Hair Down that we had rehearsed it maybe a few months prior, and it was scary because we didn't know how well it would work, but it was fine. We've played that song for enough years now that it's kind of hidden in the subconscious. But that was really special. It was actually really cool.
It was, it was. And then you guys had to go on to the next show, like in the middle of the night. I think that was the case.
Oh man, you know what? So that was a new experience for us in a lot of ways, because we normally do the sleeper bus, but because we were doing a 2-band bill, we were doing vans and hotels.
Yeah.
And when you do that, the distances and stuff can be like across Europe. When you do that, it usually means you're driving in the morning, and in our case, arriving an hour before the show. In the case of Berlin, it was a little bit more intense. We had a much longer journey to do. Where did we? I actually forget where we played the next night, but I remember we were up at 2 a.m. We had an hour's sleep or something just to try and survive, and then we were just straight back in the van driving through the night, trying to doze off if we can. I think it might have been. No, it wasn't the border crossing. I forget where it was, but yeah, we had a couple of those throughout that tour. Where we just didn't really get to sleep at all. I'm too old for that. I can't do it anymore. So hopefully that's the last time.
What are you saying? You're too... How old are you actually? Can I ask that?
I'm 36. 35, right. 36, I forget. I have to ask my wife. She knows.
That's not too old. That's 6 years more than me.
Well, that's 6 long years through the pandemic, right? I feel like every year in the pandemic is worth 2 years, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, you got a point there. All right, Sam, let's talk about The Elephant in the Room. You guys got a new album coming out next month called Charcoal Grace. I'm actually one of the lucky few to have heard the album already, because I will review it for Lots of Music. And can you tell us a little bit about your new album?
Absolutely. So it was a weird one to make, because as I sort of hinted at before, we never really got to have that finality to the Rise Radiant period. So all during the pandemic, we were being pulled in different directions. Obviously, everyone had to deal with their day jobs, and we had to deal as musicians with the idea of how do you be a musician when you can't do any of the things musicians do anymore, like touring and all that kind of stuff. So we struggled with all of that, and we struggled with the idea of saying we're going to begin the next album cycle, thereby implying that the Rise Radiant album cycle is finished. So, look, long story short, the actual beginning of the writing process was pretty hard. It took us a while to finally break into. And we saw the album as a kind of answer to the experience that we had through the pandemic, both those issues I just described, as well as that thing that we all saw in that time where, suddenly your neighbors are the ones hoarding toilet paper and, your community is sort of just breaking down in this weird way, which it was hard to not feel quite jaded by as an artist. So the album, in a sense, is an answer to that time, like, the things we learned during the pandemic, the things that we were unable to kind of escape from in that time. But our goal with the record, especially as we got through to the end of writing, was for it to represent a kind of catharsis, like both for us and for anyone listening to it. Like, this is the experience we all shared, and this is hopefully the end of that experience. And this is a kind of time capsule of that time, as well as a way for us to get rid of all of those demons. As a result, it's a much darker album than anything we've done in the past. But
that would have been my next question.
I think it's quite honest to the time. Well, yeah, let's talk about that.
I was going to ask about the inspiration behind the lyrical themes. I guess you answered part of that already. And I also have the feeling that Charcoal Grace is a little more somber, maybe a little more epic, less song-oriented, and just in general bigger than your last albums, and maybe especially Rise Radiant. Was that a conscious decision, or does a direction like that just come naturally? What would you say?
Yeah, well, we tend to be quite deliberate, like as we begin each new album cycle with a usually fairly prolonged discussion about like how we want the album to differ from what we've done in the past. I mean, I can speak for myself, although it is true for the rest of the band. Like, I'm really not someone who likes to kind of repeat themselves too much.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got to think, Rise Radiant, as you imply, it's quite a positive album, quite a song-oriented album, an album that was a reflection of who we were in kind of 2018, 2019, when we were just touring constantly and doing all of that kind of stuff. Charcoal Grace is a lot more somber, as you say, it is a lot more spacious. And those things were a reflection of what we saw in that time, as I said. But it also feels like, as an artist, it's kind of interesting to explore things like that, to sort of say, well, we're starting from this very different thematic perspective, and we're throwing away some of the sort of like quote-unquote rules we've had in the past. Like, one big element that motivated, especially Rise Radiant, was this idea that when we explore dark things, we want to do so with kind of recourse to light as well. Like, everything has a kind of counterpart, a dark and a light balance. Yeah. I tend to find that allows for the most drama as a songwriter. Like, it creates the most expressive opportunities. But there was a sense while we were writing this that it would be really disingenuous to focus on the brighter elements while the world is kind of just going through this very dark time, both internally and externally. So the album kind of necessarily had to be a little bit darker. And that being the case, we realized that it made much more sense to kind of throw away some of the other constraints that we had with Rise Radiant, like the idea of it being short and punchy and song-oriented. We wanted this to feel like we could just have time, have blank space, have, parts of songs where you get a kind of reprieve before the next moment begins, rather than just trying to zigzag between ideas. Mm-hmm. So as a result, it's a bit longer, it's a bit more spacious, it's a bit more thoughtful, I think. And I totally agree with your assessment that it is a bit less song-oriented. It feels more like a kind of start to finish listening experience, albeit quite a long one, I guess, if you're inclined. But yeah, that's where it comes from.
All right. And can you tell us what the album title means? As a non-native English speaker, I would like to hear about that a little bit.
Probably a weird one in that regard. Charcoal Grace is, in one sense, it's a very abstract title. Like, it is supposed to be something that uses language in a kind of poetic way to just make you think of something, just make your mind kind of go somewhere it might not normally. In the song Vigil, like the third part of the Charcoal Grace suite, we use the word Charcoal Grace as a kind of personification of silence. Mm-hmm. Like, if you kind of literally deconstruct the word Charcoal Grace, you've got sort of charcoal, like the end of something, right? The final result of, I guess, if you want to be really literal, final result of a fire. But grace, like the idea of it being elegant and being poised, right? So this idea that there is a kind of beauty in stillness, a beauty in silence, a sense of spaciousness in silence, but the fact that there's also in that same silence, like a kind of grimness, a kind of darkness to it. So we really wanted it to be a title that, although I've just probably deconstructed it probably more than I would personally really like. It's a title that's supposed to be just thought-provoking. Hopefully it gives you a good sense of the silence we're talking about, particularly in that song suite. But more so, just something that you could probably read a bunch of other ways that maybe I'm not even anticipating.
Okay. And what exactly inspired you to write such a behemoth of a song that is the title track? Just the prog fan in you?
It's a very prog thing. Like, once I kind of get on a path like that, again, speaking for myself, but it's true also of the other guys in the band, it's really hard to stop. I got really excited by it. In fact, I'll dig in a bit more deeply, but there's a funny little piece of trivia, which is we actually, when we got to around the 20-minute mark of the suite, I remember very actively saying, hey, we need to work out how to wrap this thing up or it's not going to fit on the side of a vinyl LP. And that was an actual problem. We needed to make sure we could, because a lot of our fans like that kind of presentation. But in terms of like why we wrote it, the short answer is it's another one of those interesting artistic limitations that when you have in front of you, like we have to create this long form song with these different song suites, these different elements to the song suite, which I have the added limitation of wanting to make it so that each song could be listened to individually, or rather each chapter in the suite could be listened to individually. And I'm one of these people who expression is at the forefront of what I do. Like I really want our music to feel emotional and, affecting. But I also get really caught up in the idea of these interesting challenges, which act almost like a kind of puzzle to solve. Like we've got this 24-minute piece of music with all of these fairly deep and dark kind of themes. I want to have it so that you can listen to it as 24 minutes of music, or you can listen to it as 4 individual songs.
Yeah.
I want all of those things to all be true at the same time. And so it ends up being a really kind of like fun as an artist challenge, like to dig into and make that work while also making the main takeaway of the experience a very emotional one. So as a result, it's a lot. Like it's something that, it demands a lot of the listener, but it's kind of part and parcel, I guess, of the experience of this kind of music. So that's sort of where that came from. It's worth saying also that it does have, as a narrative, like its kind of lyrical narrative is a very dark one, and it was one that as we started digging into, we realized it really needed space to not just feel like a throwaway concept. That sort of led to us writing a 24-minute piece of music, like the prog nerds that we are.
I guess your first one.
Yeah, well, the longest song we'd had before that was Graves, which is kind of a side length song.
Yeah.
I think, 16, 17 minutes, something like that. But, in terms of the scope, 16 minutes and 24 minutes is a pretty big difference. So It definitely took a lot of effort.
Sounds like it, definitely. It seems that during many riffs on Charcoal Grace, not just the song but the album, the bass, the guitar, and the drums are locked in very tightly with each other, almost in a djenty kind of way, might I say. Any inspiration from your more heavy peers in the progressive metal genre like Tesseract or Periphery?
Well, I think it's actually more a case of convergent evolution. Like, we probably have the same influences that bands like Tesseract and Periphery do. I grew up just loving Meshuggah, loving Sixth, loving all of those kind of bands. The thing is that I try and avoid stuff sounding too typically gent, or let's say like prototypically gent. Like I would say, the kind of approach to riffs where it's kind of only rhythm, you don't really have much harmony. I think the thing that we try and do is when we are doing these really punctuated, syncopated kind of unison oriented riffs, I try and make sure that it always has a sense of compositional place. If it's atonal, it's usually as a kind of contrast to maybe some more harmonic, more, sonorous kind of parts that might precede it. So, it's not necessarily a direct influence, but I think we probably come at it from a similar place as a lot of those bands. In other words, it acts as like the heaviest dynamic we have available. You know, how do you create something heavy and bearing a lot of movement and bearing a lot of impact? So we probably come to a similar place that a lot of those bands do in trying to answer that challenge, you know.
All right. My next question, you actually already answered. I was going to ask how these, well, as our lives have been mixed up during these last years, how these changes affected the creative process of Charcoal Grace, but you actually already answered that one. So I would like to ask you, as many songs of your previous albums were credited to yourself and your singer Jim Gray, almost in a Donald Fagen, Walter Becker kind of symbiotic way.
I love the comparison, thank you.
Can you give us a short crash course on how a Caligula's Horse song is conceived? And also, how have the influences of your band colleagues changed over the last albums, especially with your newer members, Dale Prince, and not so new Josh Griffin?
It's worth saying before I get into the answer that Dale is actually one of my oldest friends in the band.
Really?
We actually wrote songs together way back in our university days. So although he is the newest member of the band, he's a very long time collaborator. But yeah, in terms of the way we approach songwriting, it's actually a little bit different than you will find in a lot of metal bands. I think a lot of metal tends to be very ground up in the way it's written. Like, you know, there might be the majority of the song written in the musical world and then vocals and lyrics added. We try and avoid that because I like the idea that the music has a kind of symbiotic relationship, lyrics to music, where the two really rely on one another. So the way we approach it is I'll usually write maybe a short song section. It might be a verse, or, you know, it might be a couple of parts that kind of move between one another, maybe without any particular song structural goal in mind. And I'll usually arrange that enough that there'll be a good sense of the mood and the vibe. And as soon as that's there, Jim and I will start playing with melodies. Jim, our vocalist, Jim Gray, will start working on melodies and eventually lyrics for that one part. The cool thing is that once you have lyrics generated around a piece of music, you've got a really good sense of what the piece of music means. You've got both kind of the musical and harmonic vibe, like how the music makes you feel on a subconscious level, and you've got the lyrics, like the literal way the music is, the literal things the music is describing, right? So that gives us a really nice starting point then for where the song will go after that, like what section should come next in terms of contrast or in terms of supporting that part. And as you build a song out that way, you get this wonderful sense of holistic connection between the different parts and between also the music and the lyrical component. Now, in terms of how that's changed over time, in the one sense, like Jim and I have always remained kind of the main, you know, writing force behind the band. It's always going to be kind of my main musical element with his main lyrical element crossing over a lot. He'll write music, I'll write lyrics as well. But as with especially with Rise Radiant, we've dug a little bit more into sort of the other members contributing music. And I think with Rise Radiant, with Charcoal Grace, because the lead up was so protracted and because we struggled so much with the stylistic approach we would take for this album, like I said, like kind of leaving the Rise Radiant period behind and so forth, we actually had a lot more time to just throw around musical ideas. And this was a period where, especially like Dale just, you know, very prolifically kind of wrote stuff and threw it our way. Like, is this interesting to you? Is this interesting to you? It meant that when we started writing in earnest, we had this really lovely open kind of environment where everyone had sort of shown what they were feeling at that particular time musically and where we could meet in the middle. So although it hasn't necessarily changed that Jim and I are the main writers, Josh and Dale had a pretty significant hand in this record. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, The World Breathes With Me is actually the first Caligula's Horse song where every band member has a songwriting credit, which is kind of interesting in its own right. But yeah, there's you know, a lot of songwriting credits throughout the record where everyone, where different members are involved.
All right. I gotta say, it sounds great. I think Mute might be your best song yet, in my personal opinion.
I love Mute. It's my favorite song on the album. And
mine too.
I'm so happy to hear you say that. Oh, lovely. That does mean a lot, because I tell you what, like Mute, I know it wasn't really a question, but Mute's a weird one. Like Mute was a song that could have totally failed. Like, you know, the idea of having a cappella intro, a big kind of orchestra-oriented middle section. The dynamics, as extreme as they were. Mute is one of my favorite songs we've ever written. And I think it's one of the songs that hits me the hardest, like as an individual. So it's always lovely to hear that it, works for other people as well, because it is a weird song.
But it's a great one, and it certainly works. And speaking of Mute, which has a lot of orchestral elements, and I even remember a flute somewhere.
Yeah.
What I always found interesting is that Caligula's Horse don't really have a keyboard player in their lineup. They only have you performing everything else, like Rise Radiant's liner notes stated. And so you still manage to create this huge cinematic sound at times. Can you tell us how you do that, how you come up with orchestral arrangements, how they're created, performed, and in the end recorded for the album?
Absolutely. You're right in saying, we don't have a designated keyboardist. I am the de facto keyboardist and pianist and all of the other instruments, all of which I'm pretty bad at. But the beauty of doing it in the studio, I can plonk away until it sounds cool. But so my general approach with that is I like to create music with the kind of mindset of a producer. Like, it's not about what will be able to be transferable live, it's about what will sound good, and then we worry about how we make it work live later. But because Charcoal Grace is such a kind of broad and thoughtful record, the one thing we did very differently this time was we actually did hire a live orchestra, or at least a good chunk of a live orchestra that we then sort of supplemented with some program parts and things like we've done in the past. It's one of those things that obviously you can't really replicate live, short of, hiring a ton of people. I don't know, maybe we'll do that one day. It'd be pretty special, that's for sure. But I try and keep in mind the idea that any backing elements that we do, at least 9 times out of 10, are supplementary. So there are elements where, like, if we played a gig and we weren't able to use any backing tracks, would the song still work? The answer has to be yes. But we also, and me especially, I also don't like the idea that I'm restricting myself, a creative and exploratory trajectory just because it'll be challenging live. A song like Mute will be very hard to play live because we don't have a live flautist. In the past, we've had a good example is the song Into the White on The Tide, the Thief, and River's End, which also has a live flute. Hadn't actually made that connection until talking to you right now. But I used to just perform that flute part live on guitar instead. Or a song like Salt, which when we performed it live as a piano intro, I did the guitar part. I did the piano intro arranged for guitar. So, we try and sort of have it set up in such a way that we're not like a backing track band. You get a lot of those kind of bands where if you don't have the tracks, it falls apart. I tend to not write elements for the kind of keyboard or the symphonic parts that the song doesn't work without. And when that does happen, I try and make sure that there's a way that I can arrange it for another instrument or maybe change it a little bit to sort of match. But, at the end of the day, like I said, I don't want to limit myself artistically because we are a 4-piece metal band. I'd much rather explore the music and then just work out the best way to make it work live later, because I think it's a little bit more of an honest artistic representation of who I am and who we are,
Yeah. Sounds reasonable. And until now, I gotta say, it works. I've only seen you guys once.
So far.
Well, Charcoal Grace is very layered and very big as we discussed, and I'm very eager to see all those songs live. And I'm sure it will work. So we can scrap that so far.
Sure.
All right, Sam. You actually let's talk about something else. You actually completed a PhD in music a few years back, and now teach music at the Queensland Conservatorium. Is that true?
Yeah, that's right. Again, incorrigible nerd that I am, once I start doing something, it's very hard for me to stop. And I realized I had a kind of inclination for the academic side of I was going to say music, but I could say just more broadly kind of, literature studies, analysis and stuff. And I was sort of compelled to do it just because, I was teaching at different colleges at that time. We call them universities here. Actually, that's true as well for you, isn't it? I jump between different interviews where I'll throw out like an Australian word and they won't understand at all what I mean. Yeah, I taught at the college level for a while, and to sort of move up in that world, it's important to have a doctorate. I also found a bit of an inclination for things like academic writing and so forth, which was fulfilling in a way quite different to music. So I got into that. But yeah, I finished a doctorate. It was a big project, a really rewarding project in its own right. But fortunately, I haven't really lost a passion for that either, which is good because a lot of people do during the process of a doctorate.
I actually found your thesis online, and
Oh, cool.
I actually read a few lines, and I might dive into that a little more even because it sounded very interesting, very well
Yeah,
written.
nice. It's a big read.
Yeah.
It's obviously very long as doctorates tend to be, but yeah, I mean the basic premise is. When we talk about progressive rock, we tend to have this implication that there's this always forward-looking element to it. And I sort of did this element. I sort of did this analysis of like the music that appeared. It was originally just called rock in like the mid '60s, and the way that it almost immediately jumped into this very rapid advancement, like exploring ideas that really didn't exist in that music up until that time. Think the Beach Boys, the Beatles,
Yeah.
Frank Zappa, and so forth, and then contrast that against progressive rock, quote unquote, or progressive metal as we describe it nowadays. Sort of look at how the impulse towards the music's creation has changed. It's not so much a critical piece; it was really very much a labor of love because to be able to work in an analytical realm around a lot of music that I've listened
Yeah.
to and derived influence from over the years was awesome. Really fun to do.
I think you actually used the words labor of love in your acknowledgements. Is that
I
could
think I
that be?
did, yeah.
And you actually thanked, I think, Dream Theater, Genesis, and I think two more bands.
Yeah, it's King Crimson. I think
King
like
Crimson,
all of
possibly.
these, all of these artists who I've learned so much from. And the problem is, when you write academically, it's hard to not have a kind of critical element to it. Like
Yeah.
I'm pulling their music apart,
Yeah.
and I wanted to acknowledge at the start that even where I am pulling their music apart, this is music that I truly love, and
Yeah.
it means a lot to me, well beyond
Yeah.
notes on the page or thoughts in an analytical sense. So yeah.
Yeah, I get that. I studied music before as well, and I wrote a far shorter bachelor's thesis on a similar topic. And it's
Nice.
hard to stay like objective and not to just praise everything.
It's almost impossible to do so. And,
Yeah.
Again, hence having to have a kind of have a bit of an acknowledgement at the start.
Yeah. I also
Yeah.
found that you wrote an honors thesis about Steely Dan's harmonic vocabulary.
Yeah.
Very interesting connection to a prog musician, in my opinion.
I have to admit straight off the bat, that was probably the most like selfish academic endeavor I've ever done. Like I literally did that honors thesis with the idea in mind of getting to know as much about this as I can, just so I can borrow these harmonic ideas for my own music. It was entirely selfish in that way. But
I was just
I absolutely adore Steely
I was just gonna ask how that knowledge influenced you as a composer. So
Well, yeah, the cool thing was, like, with that particular thesis, I started the thesis with the idea that I was just going to come to a bunch of conclusory heuristics. Like, here's how this band approaches, or here's how these two songwriters, in the case of Walter Becker and Donald Fagen, here's how they approach different songwriting problems, like cadences, how a verse contrasts a chorus, like those kind of things. But in the end, again, for my own selfish needs, I created this set of this final chapter in the thesis, which is basically just a kind of glossary of the different ways that they approach different problems. Instead of it being like the kind of essay element, it was literally like cadences. Let's look at how Walter Becker and Donald Fagen do, 5/1 cadences or plagal cadences, or let's look at their approach to that. Let's look at their approach to, this and that. And for me, it was just amazing because, as I'm writing all of this, I'm just going, cool, I've just learned a ton of new things that I can then, immediately integrate in my own way and in an abstract enough way that it doesn't feel like I'm just doing Steely Dan stuff. I don't think anyone would accuse my band of sounding like Steely Dan, right? But instead, it was just a bunch of amazing musical building blocks that I got to learn about for, a year.
all right, I'd love to read that one day if that's available somewhere.
Yeah, I'll send it across to you if you like.
That'd be great. So we're coming near the end of our interview. You have already announced some North American tour dates for early next year. a little selfishly, I will have to ask: will you expand this tour to the other continents as well? Maybe even to Europe?
So obviously I can't spoil the specifics, but the short answer is yes, unequivocally yes. We will be touring everywhere this coming year, next couple of years, 100%. It was incredible to finally hit European shores again earlier this year, and it's been far too long between drinks. We're going to make up for lost time at this point.
All right. I guess we see each other at one of these shows at the latest. And Sam, thank you very much for taking the time to answer these questions. And yes, to everybody out there, Chalco Grace will officially hit the shelves of every well-sorted record store near you on January 26th. And I can only recommend to all of you to lend an ear to this beautiful album. And
wonderful.
Yes, I guess if you don't have anything else to say, that's all for now.
Thanks so much. It's been a wonderful chat, mate. Thank you.
Likewise. That's all for now from Sam Valen of Caligula's Horse and from Fritz of Lots of Music. Stay safe, everyone. Until next time, and thank you, Sam.
See you, mate.
All right. See you next time.
Yeah. See you in Berlin next time, I guess.
I guess so.
Wonderful. All right. Get you, mate.